So I'll start with who I am. I'm Angela. My partner, Josh, is a UX designer here in Portland. We have a really goofy dog named Frank. I'm a photographer. I really like portrait and landscape photography. As a Florida transplant, I like all of the nature you guys have out here, all the mountains and the coast and the forest. I'm an avid reader, especially sci-fi. And last but not least, I'm a QA engineer. I work for a local company called Metaltoad, where we build websites and apps for companies like Golden Globes, Meyer Memorial Trust, and AEG Presents. Today, I'm going to be mostly talking about that last one, QA. And I'll start with what that stands for. Most of you are probably familiar with QA standing for quality assurance. So breaking that down a little bit, an assurance is a positive declaration, a guarantee or a commitment. So as a QA engineer, I am guaranteeing that we'll deliver a certain level of quality to the client. But QA also stands for question assumptions. So as a QA engineer, I take a look at the assumptions that are being made by the clients, as well as by my dev team, and I compare those assumptions to the work that's being asked for, as well as the completed dev work to see if the assumptions being made are actually what's needed for the work. And then, last but not least, QA stands for quality advocate, someone who supports a particular cause and champion or an upholder. And to my mind, this is the truest interpretation of what a QA engineer is. I have to balance the needs of my dev team, our project managers, our product owners, 15 different projects and their clients and time and budget. But at the center of all of those tensions has to be the standard of quality. So as a QA engineer, I advocate for that center and I champion our commitment to quality against all of the competing needs. One of the major ways that I advocate for quality is through acceptance testing. Acceptance testing has a nice Google definition, but basically acceptance testing is when I compare the completed development work against the stated requirements. If all of the requirements have been met, the work can be deployed and added to the code base. Otherwise, it would go back to the developer for additional work before checking it again. So when does acceptance testing happen in a development workflow? This is a screenshot of our Jira board. If you're unfamiliar with Jira, it's a dashboard tool similar to Trello, and we use it to organize our workflow from start to finish. So on the far left, we have our to-do column, and it goes all the way over to done and deployed. The QA column is my column. All work that's being completed goes into the QA column, and it doesn't continue on for code review or deploy unless I'm satisfied with the quality of the work. So how do I do acceptance testing? There are a few methods that I use for most of the work. The first is acceptance criteria. As work is being scoped out by the product owner and the client, and they're creating tickets, they should come up with a set of written requirements to detail the expectations of what done means for that feature. Ideally, that list makes it into the Jira ticket for the developer to do their work against and for me to QA against as well. When it comes to criteria, there's the explicit written criteria that goes in the tickets, but I also think beyond that to implicit criteria. What's missing in the experience that should be there, or what needs haven't been met. And to that end, a lot of the implicit criteria that I think about has to do with user and admin experience. When I'm doing acceptance testing on a ticket, I'll check the requirements as an anonymous site visitor, as a site admin, and also log in as any other roles that have been created and are used frequently for the site. I'll consider the end cases for each user and make sure that the new feature doesn't affect the existing functionality of the site, so there's no regressions. As I'm checking the different roles, I make sure that the permissions aren't too broad. We start from a level of least permissive and go up as needed. And then in general, just consider how easy the site is to navigate and use for the various roles. My acceptance testing is what's called gray box testing. So backing up a little bit, black box testing is when someone is testing the site for functionality by clicking through, but they don't have any understanding about the code that's underneath it. So what I do is gray box testing, and that means that I do have some insight and knowledge into the code that's being implemented in the site. So as I test, I can look at the PR to make the pull request, to make sure that I see the expected changes in files or chunks of code. And if something goes wrong, I can troubleshoot a little bit to see if I can figure out why. So when I push that ticket back to my developer, I can communicate for them. And communication is really the most important part of acceptance testing. We do a lot of our talking in Jira. It's our source of truth for all the work that we're doing. But we also talk throughout the day in Slack, in our morning stand-up, through Basecamp. How you communicate isn't quite as important as the fact that the communication happens. Otherwise, it just leads to confusion and more work for everybody. So to kind of distill those methods of acceptance testing into an example, we had a client who wanted a partner page for their website, just a list of companies that they worked with. So there were 3 basic acceptance criteria. The site admin wanted the ability to create a partner, add a title and an image, and they wanted to reorder the partner list any way they wanted in the CMS. So the dev did the work, I got the ticket for QA, and all of the acceptance criteria was met. So in theory, that ticket should have gone on for code review and for a deploy, but it didn't. I pushed back on the ticket and asked for a rework of it. The reordering method was pretty clunky, and it was something that would have been a pain point for the site admin every time they tried to use it. So thinking about the methods that I use for acceptance testing, how does that apply to this? So the first step was the explicit acceptance criteria. Was that met or not met? It was, but even though the explicit written criteria was met, the implicit needs around how the admin could reorder the list hadn't been addressed. Having worked with CMSs for a couple of years now, I know that there are a variety of ways for a list to be ordered, and the original work wasn't the best way to do it. I also knew that the level of effort to make a change wasn't that high, and it wasn't a big ask for the developer to redo it. So the communication, I didn't just fail the ticket and move it back in the board. I included a comment on the ticket about why I was pushing the ticket back, and a suggestion for drag and drop ordering that the developer could implement next time. So we've talked about what acceptance testing is, when it comes into a development workflow, how I do it, and that leads us to the benefits and the why of acceptance testing. For the same reason that we do code reviews of a developer's work, acceptance testing just brings a fresh pair of eyes to the work that's being done. I may approach a ticket differently than the dev working on it would, and I bring my own set of expectations and assumptions about the work that's being done and the problem that it's supposed to solve. When a developer is working on a feature, they are immersed in the code and they have a very close-in view of what's happening. As a QA engineer, I come in at a higher level, and I can also look at it from an admin point of view, a content creator point of view. Acceptance criteria is a really important part of clarity of work, and doing acceptance testing implies a certain need for that criteria to exist in the first place. It helps communication, it helps the developers understand what the client wants them to solve. The code that is behind a website, most people aren't going to see it. They don't understand what's been implemented, and they don't know whether they're being impacted by it or not. But an admin will notice every time if they have to work against the site to do their job, and a user will notice if a website is unintuitive or hard to navigate. Just like code reviews ensure best practices for the code that we're writing, acceptance testing ensures that we're delivering a product that is usable, intuitive, and solves the problems that it needs to solve. And it is definitely a vital part of a development workflow. But maybe it's not a part of your workflow yet. So how do you accept acceptance testing into your development workflow? If you're not there yet, I have a couple of suggestions for getting started and bringing it up in your work. The first is to ask for acceptance criteria on your tickets. Ideally, you would ask your product owner or client for this, since they are the closest to understanding the business value and being able to provide that feedback. If that's not an option for some reason, I would suggest brainstorming it at your next sprint planning or a backlog grooming, and just giving your best assumptions about what you think the expectations of work are. But it definitely would need to be a team priority. If you're the only one who has buy-in, it's not going to happen. Not all teams have a dedicated QA engineer, so ask for a peer review. Ask one of your colleagues to do acceptance testing when they're doing code review. This is a screenshot of what a pull request template looks like for my team. So anytime you open a pull request, this is automatically what you have to fill out. Make it easy for the person to do the acceptance testing. So in instructions to QA, include what roles you want to test, expected steps for the user, and so on. And then obviously you would offer to do acceptance testing for your colleague as well. And then QA also stands for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those for you. Yeah.
You said you do the QA before code review.
Mm-hmm.
Could you expand why you chose that way? Maybe experiences?
Sure. So part of it is my personal preference. When we first started teams at my company, at Metal Toad, we didn't really have a workflow in place. So I made one. And one of the reasons is that the break in between the in-progress work and the code review work gives developers a break to do one or the other. But the code could be fine. Like, the code is usually fine, but if the underlying functionality isn't great, they'd have to re-code review it again if I push back, then it comes back. So it is a little less double work for the developers. But purely a personal preference.
Do you not do defects or anything then? Because I think that's what's
Can you clarify what you mean when you say defects?
So you use Jira, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they have a subtask that you can do that are defects. And then that goes back as a separate task.
Got it. No, we just move our own tickets back and forth through the board. So we just define our tickets by task, bug, story. And just to help keep everything in one place, we keep the same ticket in and out of the workflow. So it might make it as far as ready for acceptance, which is where the client looks at it and checks their functionality against it. And if for some reason, they think somebody is missing, that same ticket comes back to to-do. Did you?
I think the question I was going to ask, I'm trying to remember now, is something about your like the QA work that you do. I thought this stuff is interesting. I think the QA people that I work with, they're not doing the same type of work. And I'm thinking, wouldn't it be nice if they did that work? But what they're doing is maybe writing like automated tests or doing things like that. Is that part of your role as well?
Sure. So I do a variety of things. So I help set up our continuous integration. And I keep that going and coach other people on using it. I do some automated testing. I do visual regression tests. Part of it is that we're formerly a Drupal company. Like, we did a lot of Drupal stuff, and there is less of a call for unit testing and automated tests on a Drupal site, because we did a lot of kind of marketing sites. So if we're going to test like kind of the functionality of a site automated, it's the front loading to set that up is easier to do it myself.
Okay, so kind of, if I understand correctly, for the types of stuff that is being built, there needs to be a heavier emphasis played on UI and user experience, and you're also doing the more technical types of testing as well, but yeah. It's just especially important to emphasize the UI aspect.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I think it gets forgotten a lot. That's really good, yeah. And so it's just like that really close in view that developers have. It's hard to come out of that and think about, like, you're thinking about what you're doing as a developer, but it's hard to step into like the site ends shoes and see what they're doing. So yeah. Did you?
So you mentioned implicit assumptions or implicit issues that you were concerned about. And you were sort of over here, but the implicit ones don't show up until after the coding is done. Have you ever tried a workflow where you reviewed tickets before the developers picked them up and tried to make some of those implicit things a little more explicit?
Sure.
So they wouldn't have to sort of lose and then come back and
Yeah, so some of that comes up. So we are Agile-ish. So we do backlog grooming, which is every other week we take a look at the tickets that are coming into the next sprint of work, and we size them and make sure we're all on the same page. And at that point is when we discuss the criteria for the tickets and touch on implementation of them. So that's typically when it comes up. So it usually gets handled beforehand. Sometimes it gets to me and there are things that haven't been thought about. But we communicate pretty frequently in Slack. So they get caught pretty quickly.
So you mentioned you have multiple roles.
Yeah.
After James's question, can you talk about FunOps and what that means?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So FunOps is more of a cultural role. Middle Toad, I will say hands down, is just full of fabulous people. And we put an emphasis on celebrating the wins. So FunOps does things like, we launched a project, let's plan something. Someone's going away, we make sure we have appropriate planning for them. It was mostly an internal joke that our marketing director implemented on the site before he left.
Do you, like, when you're onboarding a new client, do you spend time with them in order for you to understand their needs, their personalities, so that you can more readily identify those implicit needs? I mean, is that an aspect of your job?
It's not totally. A lot of that comes from, so we have kind of our filter system, which is our project managers and product owners. So the kind of breakdown is that product owners control scope. And so a lot of the decisions of what is acceptable comes down from them, and they're in charge typically of the acceptance criteria in the ticket. But I do tend to participate in demos for our active projects. We have some support, we have probably about 9 or 10 at this point support projects that I QA, and I think we have 3 active projects that I also QA. And so when we're doing demos and things like that, I participate so I have a feeling for the client and what they're looking for and can hear their feedback in real time and kind of have that in my head for the next sprint of work.
Because you get to the point when you work with someone long enough, you can better anticipate those.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I was curious if you had like a process that you kind of already go through up front to speed, make that go faster.
No, we don't. We
That's what I
kind
do.
of depend on our product owner for that and distill all of that through him.
Yeah.
He's our kind of source of truth for the client's mindset.
Okay. So is that person involved in the review of the release as well?
Mhm.
For it?
Yeah, so in the ready for acceptance, way back here somewhere. So the ready for acceptance column is typically the product owner. Sometimes it's the client, but typically it's the product owner signing off on behalf of the client.
Then the time you get to that point, it's almost a rubber stamp.
It is, although they pay attention to it and they like have no qualms pushing back. But the communication that happens between myself and the PO and the dev and the PO is like that kind of melding. Is pretty seamless. So we actually anticipate pretty well.
Yeah.
They do a good job of being the client for us.
Cool.
Good. All right.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Angela. Okay, I think we just need a few minutes to switch over. So now would be a good time if you want to grab something to drink or use the restroom.
Or make an announcement or chat.
Complain. What else?
I also was hiring a .NET architect. If you are interested, come
Wait, so
see
you
me.
said you're a Drupal shop, so how does
So
that?
we're actually moving away from Drupal. We decided like the developers don't really want to do it anymore. It's kind of like Drupal 8's been nice, but we want to move on.
Drupal PHP?
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's just like it's a lot of configuration. Drupal 8 was a really nice change from Drupal 7, and we're very happy about that. What we want to do, we have 3 teams, and 2 of the teams do various enterprise solution types. And one of our teams does like .NET Enterprise, and we want to be everything they do but not .NET.
Okay.
So we're just looking for kind of web solutions, but that team is looking for a .NET architect. Anybody's interested? I'm going to talk to you about it.
are you going to be using a CMS for some part of that solution, or your solution is it on the .NET side as well?
I don't think so. That's not my team.
Okay.
I'm just.
I feel like this is a question I get a lot, like you want a CMS built on .NET or ASP.NET, what do you recommend? There's like a handful of choices, but I've been out of that space for so long.
Yeah.
I was curious if you guys have done any legwork around that yet.
Yeah, not on my team. We've done
Okay.
some like Laravel and Symfony. Away from
Do you know what those are built on? I haven't heard of those.
They're both
They're both PHP. Cool. You all ready to go?
I think so. Is it working?
Let's just give it, yeah.
I was like, is the mic working? But it doesn't really matter because everyone's right here. And
It is working though.
Okay.
Well, we have people.
I'm gonna go get a cookie or something.
Yeah, please do. Well, if you find a cookie, let me know.
There's a boy. I saw that.
Oh, there you go.
It's a
Yeah.
stale cookie. It's not a good cookie.
Oh no! Just pop in the microwave for 3 seconds.
And forget it.
You need someone to wash that down with.
Okay.
Sabotage.
It's just like it's kind of like the top was left open a little and it got like soft, and you wanted like the crunch, and it just kind of. Is it time to go, or are we waiting still?
Yeah, we can get started. But let me do my big announcement for you here.
Okay. I hope it's really exciting.
All right, so please welcome Jalen Ferguson. He's going to be presenting Getting Familiar with FlowType. So.
Yeah, to be honest, it's a very nice audience. I was expecting like maybe more intensity about your TypeScriptness, but so I asked earlier. I was trying to get this straight. So about half of you folks are using TypeScript in your job right now. Is that right? Roughly in the back. I don't know if you're here, Vanessa. You're using TypeScript at work. How many of you are using? Let me ask this: how many Node.js developers? Okay, actually, most of you, at least some experience there. Most of my examples will be from Node. That's where I do a lot of my work. So hopefully that will be relevant and make sense and be useful. So yeah, I'm talking today about Flow at the TypeScript Meetup, and I'm really grateful that I got invited to speak because I've been really excited about types in JavaScript. Like, I think that types have great potential to make JavaScript more effective and to help users have less, or developers have less bugs. And my background a little bit is I work at PayPal. So I've been working at PayPal for like 3.5 years. I work from home. I live in Vancouver. They're in San Jose. We used to live in San Jose. My wife is back there. And we used to live in San Jose, and then we moved up to the Northwest. But I'm still working for them remotely, and it's great. And we've been doing Node and React and typical JavaScript things for a while. But recently, we've sort of had some bugs. And I want to talk about the worst bug that really solidified my love for types in JavaScript. So imagine we have this decrypt function. We have to deal with some encrypted data sometimes because we're dealing with financial things. And we have this decrypt function. You pass it an encrypted ID, and then you're going to get back a promise that encapsulates the actual ID. So that decrypt function returns a promise. This is an important part of the bug. And then so what I do with that is I'll get my decrypted ID, and then I'll pass that to this update user data function, sort of pretend function, but you get the idea. And with that function will take the ID and a callback. If there's an error, I'll try to log that. I have this pretty printer thing that will sort of print out error messages in some sort of nice way for us locally, or log them in a useful way. And then, so putting it all together, we grab the ID, we send it to the update user data function. If there's an error, we log the error, and if there's a success, we just render success, and it's all good, right? It seems like it's fine. And looking at the code, I think it's fairly difficult to see how many mistakes that are in this little code. Like, this all passed code reviews, everyone's happy, we're finally testing on live, and we realized like we made so many mistakes. Like it's not good. It's all wrong. So what we did wrong was we forgot that we're dealing with a promise. And so we said, oh, we'll just take the decrypted information and we'll just pass it right up to the server. Well, that means we have a promise object that we're passing up to the server. We're not passing up a raw value. We have to use something like await, if you're familiar with async await, or something like do a then and wrap it in a callback function if we actually want the value out of that promise. And the other thing that we did wrong was instead of logging the error, in this particular case, or this particular terrible bug, I logged the whole response object. It seemed like a good thing to do at the time, and looking at it, you don't really know, like, response, error, what's the difference? Well, the difference is, in this particular case, starting at the beginning, when I call update user data with the ID, it's going to turn that ID into this JSON object that it sends up to the server. Well, if you try to JSON.stringify a promise, it's going to actually give you an empty object literal, which doesn't, or like a string with braces in it, which is not any sort of good ID to have. The service in this case just got kind of confused. It returned an error as a string instead of a JavaScript object because it's an old service, and it sort of got confused. And then incorrectly, instead of passing in the error, which would have gotten confused out because it was a string anyway, but we accidentally passed the whole HTTP server response object. So, and Node, that's this like giant object which has like copies of the request and copies of all the headers and the cookies and like all these like cyclical loops that like point to itself and these pointers. And so I passed that to our pretty printer function, and it literally takes 60 seconds of like completely blocking like async IO, Node really fast, whatever. It just completely blocks for 60 seconds because we don't have threads in JavaScript. So essentially like it just destroyed, like anytime this code path happened, our whole server couldn't do anything for 60 seconds because it was printing a really fancy log. And that's when I realized I really love types in JavaScript. If I had types, I wouldn't have had any of those problems. And so there were like 2 type mistakes in the like little 4 lines of code that cost us, I mean, literally, we were like, a whole team was up to like 11 o'clock or 9 o'clock or some sort of late time on a Friday night and a Thursday night. And, I'm like having to put the kids, or my wife's having to put the kids to bed for me because I'm like intensely working and not doing this. It's all very traumatic. And so I realized we don't need to have these traumas. We can use types in JavaScript and it's better. So you're thinking, awesome, we'll use TypeScript. It's perfect. It solves all our problems. Well, sort of. Thing is, I have been working for a long time on the ESLint project, which I really love. And I love linting and static analysis, which is kind of like types, but sort of not as good and sort of different. And that doesn't really work with TypeScript right now. They're working on a fork, and I'm not really working on it, contributing actively anymore because I have things, but I like care about that. I want ESLint. And then we use Babel a lot as well, and we have all these plugins that we depend on, and so we're sort of invested in this other ecosystem. I think of TypeScript as having its own really awesome and productive ecosystem of projects and tools, but we're sort of like invested in a different ecosystem of projects and tools, and you can sort of like cake them together, but then you're just sort of feeling like really bulky, like your tooling just becomes unnecessarily heavy. You're duplicating all this work. Like, how many times do I need to convert my ES6 into ES5, like with 3 different tools? Like it just started to feel a little bit too heavy, and I couldn't like convince the team. We have like 20 developers working on this thing, like, just like throw away all your tools. I want to show you TypeScript because I hate having server bugs. They're like, no, you can't do that. It's too much. And then also, for some reason, people like really hate using a different file extension sometimes. I think that's like something that can be overcome. Like, I really don't think it's a big problem, but there's like this sort of gut reaction people have, like, I'm not going to do that. I'm like, okay, why? But whatever. So these are some of the issues that I dealt with. So I did do like a test in TypeScript, and we just felt for our project, for our team, it wasn't something that we could overcome some of these hurdles. So we decided to check out Flow. Well, in Flow, like, it will enforce types, which is what we wanted. So like, number 1 feature, like, seems to be there, which is a good thing. And then it was really easy to get started. I found with TypeScript, I was a little bit stressed out. I felt like I convert a file to .ts and then it would have like 80 errors. And I got a little bit like, this is very hard. It's telling me to do so many things, and it was like, I had to like add types all over, and I just got kind of sad about it. With Flow, it was very much like, you don't have to add types to anything. We're just kind of like, you just go at your own pace, which has some limitations. Like obviously, it's a bit of a controversy. Is it a good idea to be so flexible? I don't know. You tell me. So then the learning curve was easy, blah, blah, blah. It worked fine with all our tools. I really love Flow. So getting started, you just have to install this like really terribly named Flow bin package with npm. And then usually just put it in your package JSON file, and you can run Flow init. And Flow, unfortunately, is written in OCaml, which is cool. Like, I don't know a lot about functional programming languages and things like this, so people think it's really great. For me, it means that it's kind of awkward if I wanted to contribute to the project, because I don't know how to read OCaml code. So anyway, it uses like this server that's kind of running in the background so that it can try to be really fast about telling you your errors. Like it keeps everything in maybe some sort of memory store or something, so it can be really optimized. I don't know. I think TypeScript is probably simpler in this regard because it's written, I think, in TypeScript, which is nice. But here we go. So we set it up like this, and hopefully in most projects, once you just install Flow, you just run it and it'll have no errors. Unfortunately, when I tried to use Flow the first time, I got like 1 million errors because our project is really big and we have all this code, and Flow by default, it goes through your node modules folder and will start trying to find flow types like in your other files, like in node modules, and like sort of, I don't know, it just seems like it's invasive a little bit. Like it's looking in all of your secrets and finding types and trying to tell you that you did something wrong. So it's telling me that like basically what happened for me when I started using it was if it went into my node modules folder and found that like Facebook had included like some .flow files, which is like this weird way you can type things in Flow if you really want, but not a lot of people do. And it was like a different version of Flow and had some incompatibility, so it's complaining. So you have to like, if you ever see something like this, you just have to go in your config file and just be like, ignore all that stuff. Like we don't really care. We only care about our files for the most part. So once you do that, I'll tell you now, it's very stressful. I had a hard time. I was like constantly like typing to James Kyle on Twitter and other people from Flow until they explained how to solve all those problems. But eventually they got solved, and now I really, really, really love Flow so much. So let me show you how to use it. First step, adding types to files. So here I have this code with a subtle bug. I have this eDonut function. It takes a donut and a person, and I'm passing the person first and the donut second, which happens in JavaScript all the time. And we just say, oh, it's fine. Like we'll just catch it, in production. Like if there's a problem, like we'll just notice it in the code. And you think, no, we don't want to do that. We could actually catch it beforehand. Like why would we want to? It really stresses me out when I see things like this. And I'll find this in my code and think, whoa, wait, what are we doing here? So if you want to add types to this, first you have to add this weird flow comment at the top, like @flow. You can also put this in a block comment. Maybe that's what we get because we don't use .ts. We have to use @flow everywhere. I don't know. It's a trade-off. And then you can just put your types like here, :type. Is that the same as TypeScript? You just put :type. So it's nice. It's the same. You can just rename it .ts. It doesn't matter. Use the same thing. And then if you actually want to create these types, so confusing. Yeah. Or I can rename mine to .ts. It doesn't matter. So here's one that's different. So I'll say about Flow, they don't have any like new things. It's just JavaScript with some type syntax on top. If what I remember is right about TypeScript has like new things. Like there's an enum and there's like different objects and like lots of cool new syntax. It's kind of like its own language, like a really nicely designed, beautiful and wonderful language. And Flow is like, no, you can just write your bad JavaScript and I'll show you how to type it. Like it's kind of it's a slightly different way to think about things. So for this is like FlowType's version of enum. You're just basically saying, okay, donut is either a maple or a chocolate or glazed, and those are the 3 strings you can use, and it's one of those things, and that's all it can ever be. So it's actually called a literal type, where it's exactly this, and then the pipe is a union type, so it's exactly this or exactly this or exactly that. That's like one simple way to do a type. You just write type and donut, and then it could be one of those 3 things. And then let's say for a person we want to do an actual class, because classes are sort of typical way of doing object-oriented things. So the only thing that's different from a normal ES6 class here is that at the top you have this, you sort of declare the properties. So name is a type string. Is TypeScript have similar syntax? I just wanted to have something totally different and amazing, but so far it's basically all the same. The truth is, so for PayPal, I go to the TC39 like JavaScript committee meetings sometimes, and I just think, why don't they just add types to the language? Then we don't have to have all this fighting and different tools. But what I hear from talking to folks there is that it's kind of like complicated, because you can add types to the language of JavaScript, but then everything has to be backwards compatible. And then like, do you have runtime checking added to the browsers? There's like all these kind of weird questions about it, or like, do they have to do a first pass so no one can agree on anything, so they just give up. Anyway, name string. And now we have our donut type and our person class. And so now we've like properly typed this out, but you'll see we're still doing things in the wrong order. But now that we've added types to everything, we should get our error message. So indeed, Flow, one problem with Flow is that Flow apparently has way worse error messages than TypeScript, because they use like a different system for determining how types work, which is a very flexible and cool system, but you just kind of get this weird message like, person, this type is incompatible with the expected param type of, and then it's like next line string, you sort of get used to reading it, but at first it's a little bit jarring. You just think that it's like two different errors or something. So it basically it's saying, hey, your params are switched. So I can go ahead and switch the params, and then I have the problem that I have donut first, which is correct, but my donut isn't actually included in the list of acceptable enum values, so it's going to complain about that one too. So you get the idea. It works. Like, that's what you would expect from a type system, to complain about types. So basically, once you finish adding your types and you correct everything, you should get no errors, which is the correct output. So it's amazing. That's Flow. Don't worry, I'm not over quite yet. The thing is, if you're starting with a new file from scratch, it's just easy. It's just nice. But if you're having like in a whole big project, like I was talking about earlier, with like thousands of files and client-side JavaScript and server JavaScript, you might ask, like, is it going to be kind of too hard to add types to an existing project? And I would say no. It's a good migration strategy, actually, because if you just add this like @flow to things, you can kind of do step by step. So for me, the things that bug me at work, that get me in trouble with our code, are dealing with amounts. You're dealing with amounts, okay, at PayPal. We're formatting amounts. And you have a function, it's like format amount, and it takes a value called amount. Let me ask you, what type is amount going to be there? Is it going to be a number, or is it going to be a string? Well, if it's coming from the browser, like an input field, it's always going to be a string. If it's coming from the server, it might be a number. So you get this type all the time where you're like, okay, is this going to have a toString property on it, or a toFixed? You understand, it's very confusing. So adding types there allows us to have a lot of clarity around like amount processing and amount formatting. The other area is anything dealing with services. This is where we always get like confused, making sure that the data coming back from the service is like that we handle that output in an expected way, and we sort of can figure out, okay, this service should return data that looks like this, so let's expect it to look like that and be consistent about it. Those are two places in our app where we decided to use Flow first, because we can just opt in a few files at a time. The other thing is, when you opt in a file with Flow, the only thing it requires you to do is just add types to public interfaces. So like any functions that you're exporting or making like publicly accessible, those functions it will make you add types to. Anything that's internal, it won't force you to add them. You can add them if you want, which can get you in trouble if you forget to add types for things that matter. But it is still nice. And then instead of a transpiler, you use something like Babel, and then it will just like rip the types out before it goes to process your code. So if I want to run ESLint on my code to do static analysis, I just rip out the types and then run it like they weren't ever there. So it's pretty easy to add this to an existing setup. As long as you already have Babel ecosystem in your thing, it's not so bad. So I'm going to go in a little bit. Oh yeah, this is my Babel setup, but no one cares. Talk about syntax, but I'll stop for a second and ask, does anyone have any questions? I'm kind of just rambling on, and I think it's fine, but I'm wondering if anyone has questions. Oh, go ahead. From the front here. What was your name again?
James.
James, yeah, if you could.
So for anyone here who knows very little about Flow but knows a a lot more about TypeScript. I will
Oh,
say this.
cool.
I think both teams have been learning a lot from each other over the last 3-4 years.
Mm.
And I've seen a progression of borrowing ideas. So,
Yeah.
if you haven't looked at TypeScript lately, you might be surprised to see how they've been influenced.
Honestly, every time there's like a new announcement, yeah, like last week when or whatever, when they came out, they're like, you can just use .js files now. I was like, ooh, that's very nice. Very fine. And I know the Babel team is actually actively working to add TypeScript to the Babylon parser, which will mean that we'll have like full ecosystem support for TypeScript in the near future.
I have not heard this from the
James,
team.
there's a question back
But I would
there.
highly suspect that TypeScript will eventually get to the point where static analysis and transpilation will be separate things, and you'll be able to turn one off. So if you can't do that today, but I'm going to put money down that says they'll do that in the future.
Okay, it's exciting things to come, according to James. Yes.
So is there like an AST parser with Flow? So if I add Flow to my project, can I go like parse the files and actually do some logic based on?
Okay. Let me see if I get this correct. I may be incorrect here. Acorn is the parser that uses by ASLint, for example, the AST parser, assuming you're familiar with Acorn. And as far as I understand, Acorn has Flow support already. So the only thing that it might do, though, I can't remember if it has Flow support or if it just ignores Flow altogether. So that's a pretty big difference. I can't remember if it won't complain about Flow, but I don't know if it actually has like a proper AST or if it just kind of ignores it. Whereas I know TypeScript is it correct? The TypeScript has a full AST. I think with Flow it might, the parser, the Acorn parser, there's a Flow plugin for it. I don't know if it adds it to the AST or if it just kind of ignores it. So I'll have to look into it.
You can also provide an example where Babel plugin is stripping out the typing information from generated JavaScript or the transpiled JavaScript. Why would you do that?
Why would I strip out the types?
Yeah.
Oh, so what it does is you just take the types out so that it can run without breaking your browser.
Usually the syntax like in TypeScript is like JavaScript neutral. It tries to it tries to pick it.
So Flow does not rewrite your JavaScript at all.
It's not transpiled. It's just you add some stuff to your already like JavaScripty JavaScript. You're not writing the Flow language. You're just writing JavaScript and adding a few types.
It's only type check.
Yeah, so if I do the colon string, or something, I assume it's going to be ignored by the browser.
No, it'll blow up.
It'll blow up.
It'll just and your code will be absolutely useless to everyone, and you will be so sad. So don't ever try that, please. You have to just take out the types. It's not worth risking making all of your customers sad. I think these are good questions, and I like halfway answered them. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll talk about Flow syntax, and you'll say, "Oh, that looks like TypeScript," and then we can go home. So let's say you have functions like this one. You can just kind of you have your parameters, and then I don't know, like the return value you put on the end with a colon. It can get to like long. You get these long strings. It is what it is. And then if you want to give a variable, one thing about Flow is that it tries to like just kind of figure out what things are magically. So if you don't tell it what type something is, it will just sort of say, you look like a string. You're probably a string. We're just going to make you a string. So it does some of that. There's a name for it, but it just like guesses most of the time. But if you want to be explicit about what your stuff is, you can put like colon and then the type. I think this is very common type syntax in JavaScripty languages. Yeah, so that's pretty familiar. The next thing is if you want to define the types. I think this is maybe slightly different than TypeScript. So here's an example of a type you might define called liquid. And liquid will have like a viscosity, like a, I don't know, mushiness or something. And that will be a number. And it will have an optional property of boiling point. And that's not required to have. So then anytime you have something with a viscosity, it can sort of sneak into being called a liquid. And so it's sort of, with Flow, you kind of have a little bit of flexibility, and like if it looks like a liquid and it talks like a liquid, we'll call it a liquid. Whereas if you use classes in Flow, it will be explicit, like is this the actual class? But if you use types, it's more like looks roughly the shape, which is frankly like kind of in JavaScript where you're used to sort of, there's a name for it, but I can't remember the name. All those things. We're used to lots of things. None of those, duck typing, I think was the word I was going for. It's kind of like, if it sort of looks roughly like the thing, we'll just assume it's the thing. That's kind of what Flow's doing here. It feels JavaScripty to me. And then this is the enum thing again, where you could have this fat type and it's like margin, butter, or lard. Or you can also do something called type alias, which is if I want to say that this pancake function returns a pancake, but I don't really like want to make pancake its own class, I can just be like pancake is string. And so it'll just sort of say, it'll be like, oh yeah, it's a pancake, but it'll just be a string. You know, it's nice. It makes you feel like you added types, but you didn't really do anything. I think it's fine. It's totally fine. So classes we talked about. If you have a method on your class, then it's like you do the colon thing and then the colon again. Again, I don't like how long it makes everything, but it's fine. Modules, it's just like functions. It's so obvious. It's fine. And then comments. Flow has this thing. I think TypeScript stole it too recently. I might be wrong. Where you can just like put all of your types in comments. This is the way that you can do it without changing anything. So if you use this, it can do the type checking. All the type stuff is just inside of comments, and for some reason it will just read it out and enforce the types.
I don't recognize that. Is that JSDoc a version of JSDoc?
It's just wild. Yeah, it's literally just your types, but you just hide it inside of these comments.
So yes, they stole the idea, but they used JSDoc.
They probably have a better way. This is like, this is a bit.
They put it above the function.
I actually don't know if, like in JSDoc format, which is probably makes more sense. So this is like what you do if you want to kind of, if people are like, I don't want to use Babel, I don't want to have anything, it's like, well, you can do this weird thing, but then it just feels a bit, it's so messy. Like, I'm never going to write this. I just don't recommend this at all. But it's an option. It sounds really cool. It's like you don't even need any sort of transpiler. You can just put in weird comments all over the place. It's like, I'll just take the transpiler. It's actually not as bad. Medicine, thank you very much. There's maybe types, and it will enforce them properly. So if I say I have a name and it's maybe a string, which means like it could be nothing. It could be undefined. Then Flow, they should just be the same. It's just like annoying at this point. Flow will make me check that it exists. It will complain very much if I don't actually have a check to make sure that, okay, it's either gonna exist, otherwise it's got to be something else. So it will enforce that it's there, which is nice. So it does a lot of like enforcing. I think I have another example that's better. Here's a fancier example. So let's take one of those union types that I was talking about. So this is a number or a string. This is amounts. This is the worst to deal with. This is what I'm always at work dealing with. Oh, hello.
If you go back to the previous slide.
Of course.
This is one of those places where this is actually different than TypeScript.
Oh, tell us more.
Usually these string, the question mark would not be at the front of the constant type there.
Would it be on the other side of the colon?
It's on the other side of the colon. It's optional.
Thank you for that.
It's more complicated than that.
Yeah, I know. But I just pointed out that would, I just ran a quick test to verify that, yeah, when you compile TSC.
Can I take 30 seconds to explain
He's
this?
doing a good job. Anything else?
No, that was it. I just want to bring it up.
Yeah, so there's some slight differences. Go ahead, please.
Flow by default is like TypeScript with strict null checking turned on.
Which is awesome. You should turn that on.
Which means that if you have a parameter in your function, null or undefined is not valid unless you do this and turn it into a maybe type.
But maybe types, are they defined slightly differently syntax-wise in?
I think that's what I was going to
He's saying the syntax might look slightly
The
different.
reason why I say it's more complicated is because you have to opt into it because it's a newer feature. So you have to go in and config and say, I want strict null checking.
Strict null checking, yeah.
Then
Which came in
all
like
your
2.0.
types no longer, they say they shard off null and undefined are no longer part of the type.
Yeah, because they're annoying and they cause bugs. You have to.
So then
Real quick on this, because this is a very big point for me. The true thing is one of our like co-worker teams at PayPal, they started using TypeScript and like TypeScript is so great. It's like the greatest thing. And then I'm like looking at their server logs and I see like undefined is not a function all over the crash logs. I'm thinking, types didn't really save the day, did they? That was like why I was like really skeptical for a long time. And then Flow was like, we will not let you do that.
Right.
You have to have, you can't, you can do any type, but you can't do, like it does the null checking and undefined checking by default, which is so wonderful.
So you're right, but I was just pointing out, like he said, we would put like, instead of name, colon, string, or any, instead of like question mark.
Slightly different syntax for achieving the same
So
thing.
yes and yes.
Thank you. What was your name?
Fine.
Mike, that was really helpful. I appreciate that,
You
Mike.
just pointed out earlier, like it's mostly, I'm trying to find something that's different than technical.
No, you really helped us, Mike. Thank you for enlightening the whole group. So this one is my favorite. This is actually useful for me in my life, which is when we're formatting amount and we define this amount or number thing, and usually like we should just have a better API, but assuming we're just typing something that already happened, and we're so flexible, like, oh, it could be this, could be that. So maybe if it's a number, then we'll call like toFixed on it to just plop off all the decimals, or if it's a string, we'll call %, and then we'll toString it again just to be thorough. I don't know. So, but if we have, if it's that amount or number, it will actually be very thoughtful and make sure that we take care of each of those cases. So if I just said return %, amount, toString, actually that one's a bad example because that will work. But if I call return amount .toFix 0, it'll say, hey, actually this could be a string. You can't do that. That will get you in trouble. So it'll do the nice checking that I want and ensure that I handle both cases properly, which makes me feel really nice about it. And I think if I forget, like in my if check, like if I forget one of them, it'll do a good job of making sure that I handle all of those cases automatically for me. And the other thing that it'll do, which we just talked about a lot and we'll talk about again, is if I happen to call format amount here without any value, it's going to complain like 8 times. Again, I don't know why Flow complains, like the error messages are so verbose, but it'll complain so many times that I just didn't include things, because they're like, you didn't include a number, and you also didn't include a string, you didn't include anything. And so it'll be very thorough in telling me that I did it wrong. So sometimes I'll see like, you have like 40 errors and it's just like one thing and I just have to like fix it or something, but it's very helpful. It'll call it out like so strong, like I made a mistake. So that way I can feel so sure that if something's gonna happen, it'll scream. It's like having a dog like at your front door, like someone comes, it's just the mailman, but there it is, like protecting you. It's nice.
Only it's a dog that can talk.
Yeah, it can talk a lot. The too much is the problem. So other stuff like, yeah, there's arrays and there's any type, but it's kind of like, it's when you're feeling lazy about it. There's interfaces. I know that TypeScript has interfaces. That's like a common thing. In Flow, it's not as big of a deal because they have that type thing, which is a more generic kind of way. I think interfaces, if you want to be more strict, you can use interfaces to do things with classes, but it's not as common. There's tuples, so you can enforce a certain ordering of an array. So an array maybe has a string and then a number every single time. Generics. And then they also have support for including types with an NPM package. And what is that called in TypeScript land? Like the installing like typed, what is it?
Like
At types or
Like type Fs or
definitely typed. Yeah, that's the same thing. It's called FlowType. It's the same thing as definitely typed. I know that there's some work being done by some folks to try and figure out like a way to interop those type definitions or like automatically generate one from the other, because they're really similar as we discussed, but it's not quite ready yet. Also a really interesting feature that I heard about recently, one of our teams at PayPal uses this runtime checking. So it actually will call out errors while you're using your application, like in development mode, of course, in QA or something, to make sure that the types are really checking as they're supposed to, because you can do static analysis, but runtime checking is helpful if you're getting data from a server that maybe doesn't match the definition that you expected to get from the server. So it can help you make sure that your types work out in real life, because as you probably all know, as much as we can use static analysis to figure out what's happening, sometimes the real world throws very strange things at you that we couldn't anticipate. And so the runtime checking in a development mode can be helpful with that. So anyway, my pitch is this. If for some reason TypeScript doesn't work, you can try Flow. It might also work for you, and you might like it. And hopefully we can get everyone excited about type JavaScript together. So that's the end. You can clap, and then I'll answer your questions. Thanks. Okay, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, what about tooling? Like if I want to have like, my IntelliJ or
Yeah, I use the Visual Studio Code. VS Code, and they have Flow. WebStorm has Flow support. All of the many tools out there. What's the Atom and all of these types of tools. Probably Vim. I don't know about Vim, to be honest. Maybe it has it.
Vim's got everything.
Yeah, it's already in Vim, I'm sure. So yeah, there's good tooling. I will say maybe TypeScript is sort of better tooling, but this is like it's acceptably okay. I'll put it.
It's a service, right, that runs, a language service runs with your IDs, right?
It's very nice. Yeah, one day when they fix all the things that made me not use it, I'll use it for sure. I'll get there. They're working on it. I know that the TypeScript team. I met folks from the TypeScript team, and they know about all the reasons why people don't want to use TypeScript, and they're actively working on all of them. So I'm really super impressed with those folks and the Flow folks.
Just to be clear, there's no translation whatsoever. It's like TypeScript had like an enum, right? Just kind of like a distributed type of values, but not really.
No, Flow doesn't have anything like that. They just have some types, and you just have to remove them before you execute your code. It won't change your code in any way except for the things that you add, which is why you can hide it all behind comments, because it doesn't actually. It's all just JavaScript plus types. It's not a separate language, for good and bad. You're basically stuck with using something like Babel if you want to use Flow, because it's like halfway to TypeScript. It doesn't go as far. Mike, you're on timeout. Any other questions? Once another person asks a question, you can ask another question. Okay.
You didn't show any like typing between files. Like how do you handle all that stuff? Like how do you handle cross-file typing? It seemed like everything was
The modules. So
the thing that you don't.
I was like, no one cares. So with modules are actually the one thing that once you opt into Flow, it will make you do. It makes you do this. So you don't have to type variables or anything else, but once you opt in and file into Flow, it will look for all of your publicly exported functions, whether you're using AS6 or CommonJS or something else, maybe even AMD, I don't know, whatever module format you're using. It'll try and add those types. It'll make you add those types to them. And then if another file that you're using has Flow enabled, it'll read those and enforce those. And I believe you'll get, back to your question, Mike, I believe you'll get autocomplete stuff. But again, I think the TypeScript autocomplete and that stuff is a little bit better. Let's be honest. They've worked on that a lot. Yeah, you get all those good things that I don't know about because I've been doing JavaScript for like 10 years. Yeah.
So adding add flow comment to a module, anything that you export out of there, it will be an error if you don't define explicit types.
Yeah, of the parameters and the return type for it. So that's a bit about Flow. It's nice. It's just a nice thing to do for your JavaScripts.
How much?
Oh.
People make a big deal about, when I say people who've used Flow, like its inference. Do you find that you don't define a lot of types, or do you find yourself over time being more explicit and not relying upon the inference?
I'll answer your question with a statement that's somewhat unrelated. So I will answer the question of this. How hard has it been for me to get the team to adopt Flow fully, and how much coverage do we get on our files? So what I'd say is I got really excited about Flow after we had that bug that I was telling you about that was like freezing all of our servers and not giving us any error messages because it was timing out forever. And so I was thinking, this is something that we should do. We should add types. And so I added types, and then I said, okay, everyone, like, do some code review and like merge this type stuff in because it's so great. And people were sort of like, that's weird. Like, what is this? Types? I don't know. And eventually they're like, okay, we'll do it. And so check. And they went for it. And then like a month later, someone's like, hey, I'm like adding TypeScript, or I'm adding flow types to this one thing, like one file. Would you review that? And then so I was like, okay, good. And usually what they will do is they will only do the functions that are required at first. And then later when we have a bug or we go revisit some code, I'll say, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we got a little bit more specific here? So you'll see our functions, like we'll like add types like half the variables in the functions, the ones that seem like kind of confusing, and the ones that are obvious, like numbers, strings, basic types, we'll just sort of leave them. One of the inference things that works really well is object literals. So with Flow, if you have an object literal, it will know like your type has to look exactly like this everywhere you use it. You can't depend on some other property. So it does. There are a few cases where you actually have to go and find the source object, like the first place it was defined, and make sure to add like a placeholder for future things that get added to it. There are some other ways around it, but I've actually found that has helped me think more clearly about the objects that I'm using. Because since we've not really been like class people in our jobs, we're like, we'll just make object literals of everything and just have like random shapes all the time. And this has helped us think a little bit more clearly. Like we have 5 or 6 different amount objects that have like a currency code, an amount, and like a decimal, and they're all like different named properties. And adding types, you're starting to think, it's kind of a good idea if we have the amounts that we use in our code, actually have the same shape everywhere. Like, what a cool idea. So I will say Flow has helped us think more critically about our code, though it's a slow process. We've adopted it slowly. We definitely haven't added like great coverage on all of our files. We really just start with imports, the parameters and returns, and most of the stuff that happens in the middle we sort of hope works out. So it's pretty sloppy. It still feels JavaScripty. Yeah, what was your name?
I'm so sorry, I'm Nate.
Oh, thanks, Nate.
I have to ask this, and maybe it's because I came in late, but you're in the module.exports, you're passing a parameter, you're requiring it to be a string, and then you have :string outside those parens where I would expect to see nothing. What is that doing?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. That is, and I'll go back to the function one in a second. That is saying that the return type of this function is a string. So there I'm defining the return type of the function.
Oh, and the other place you're defining what you're comparing.
The other one I'm defining a parameter. Here I'm defining the return. If you go back, one of the earlier examples I used is this like pancake function. Mm-hmm. So the return type is pancake.
Has to be a pancake.
Yeah, it only returns a pancake. You don't want to get an undefined. You don't want to open up. I guess that's a waffle I'm thinking of. But you know what I mean? You pour the batter in there. It's got to exist. Like, I don't want to see any undefined at the end of this function. Or null, like, we're getting the pancake. Anyway, that's it for me, folks. Thanks for letting me come to your meetup. Yes, one more question.
Is that a wait? So you just closed it down?
No, it's coming back.
You want to get out of here.
I'm having fun, actually. I forgot my password. Hold on.
There's no beer. It's good.
Yeah, pancake.
At the top, you have, so what he was just talking about, so we have get pancake
Yep.
parameters, and you have pancake. Is that a way to, is that like a really weird way to statically type JavaScript?
No, this is Flow only. So you couldn't do that in normal JavaScript land.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
It's only Flow. So yeah, great question. This syntax will only work with Flow. That's one of the things that when you run your Flow type thing, it'll just steal it away. It'll take it away.
I know, like in Python, they have something called myPy, which also is a way to statically type through functions.
I just want the language, JavaScript language, to have some of this functionality, so we don't have to argue about all the tools. Yeah, wait a second. This is a problem. Never mind. I don't want this. Go ahead.
I've been learning Flow and
Trader.
Yes, that's true. But I'm duck typed, so no. Anyway, the syntax is really, really close. Like you have to work hard to find something. Like I've been working hard to try to pull out those differences, and it's really similar.
Yeah,
even the behavior. That's why.
There's like kind of discussions and sort of small disagreements between the Flow teams and the TypeScript teams. I think they're generally friendly and they're generally try to discuss their ideas and the best way to do things, but there's some strong different ideals about how type systems should work, and very like intensely thoughtful folks thinking about the best way to do things in a way that means that they're maybe going to continue doing things on their own paths. But I think they're both going in great directions, and they are both borrowing from each other liberally. So I think it's a good outcome, more or less.
One of the more confusing things for me was they have an any type of flow.
Mm-hmm.
It is not what any means in TypeScript.
What does any mean in any means in Flow that it can be anything, which I think seems obvious.
It's from my perspective, it's a little more subtle than that.
Okay.
Any in Flow means it's never going to be type checked.
Yeah, that's true. It basically says it could be anything, so we're not even going to check.
And we're never going to bother to enforce anything. Whereas, unfortunately, any in TypeScript is overlaps partially into that and says it can be anything. But now they've gone in TypeScript's improved inference.
Yeah.
Will look at the execution of your code, and if you constrain the type, so if you do an assignment,
Like add a value to it or assign it something
now
later.
it knows it's a number, and now it can say that any is now a number, and so now I know you can't call.
That's a good idea.
But that's different.
Yeah.
Any in Flow does not behave like that. It's by out of the box default behavior does what TypeScript is trying to do. Like if you declare a variable and don't give it a type and then assign it,
Yeah.
and then try to use it, what I described with TypeScript's new any improved
Yeah.
inference, that's how Flow's always worked, to my knowledge.
The default Flow
Right.
inference, it's TypeScript.
That's why I say I think the TypeScript team, I was interested to hear that
Yeah.
they're saying we're looking at that. You can tell they're looking at that because they're improving their inference story, and
I don't know for sure how many people are working on each
Yeah. project,
but I feel like TypeScript has a ton of resources on it, and it will work really, really fast. Flow, I think, has done really well with. I have no idea how large the team is, but I think they've done really well with what I can imagine isn't a very huge team. It's impressive to see. I think we'll see. And for me, this is about. I know the React folks are kind of more in the Flow camp because of Facebook, but in my experience, I really love types for server code because when our servers crash, our customers are really frustrated because it essentially just means that they can't use the website at all, or their whole experience freezes up for a long time, and that means they can't send money to their family or do whatever, purchase that thing online. It's really horrible at my job when someone is going to crash our server, and types can really help that. So I'm super excited about them on the server side. I know they're popular elsewhere, but to me, this is like such a good use case.
Can I ask you one more question?
I think so.
When you say flow in it, from the command
Yeah.
line at the root of your project, that starts up the Flow server or service that's now watching your file system for that root folder, right?
When I run Flow init, I don't know if it does that. It probably does that. It also creates like a Flow config file with some default things. So it sets up some config, and I think it probably does start some sort of background.
Flow run that is also the.
Yeah, it's confusing.
Anyway.
The first time you run Flow, if nothing else happens, it'll start this service in the background
Right.
that is automatically like watching your files and keeping some sort of track of everything that's happening, so that when you change, it can be pretty quick on giving the output.
It already has done the analysis, or is very close to, so that when you say flow check, it can just give you the answer because it knows what the problems are.
Yeah, the thing that will not work though is if you change any type definition anywhere, it sort of has to redo the processing. And unfortunately for me, when I'm adding new types, when I'm dealing with Flow, I'm usually not just working in code, I'm usually adding new types. And so each time you add new types, it kind of breaks the cache because it has to reprocess everything, because you define types and it can sort of read them from anywhere. So it's not perfect.
Do you have any idea if that service is scoped into that project? And if you go to another folder, in another instance of your command line and type flow run, you get another process?
It should be. I hope so. But I don't know if there's like one super Flow daemon running under the surface, or if there are many. All I know is if you do like PS AUX or whatever, you'll have like a million things running. That's really annoying. If you're like trying to kill them all, it takes forever. So when you're having like problems with Flow and you find all these processes running, doing all this secret magic, that's what makes it fast and good. It's kind of frustrating. I feel like TypeScript is probably less confusing because it just transpiles it. It's like one and done. And here it's like got all these secret magic servers running underneath the hood. I don't know. It's kind of
I was just curious. I keep meaning to run a test and I haven't bothered to.
Yeah. So basically the answer is I have no idea, but thanks for asking.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Any more questions? Okay, you can clap again. Thanks for having me.
Hopefully that wasn't too painful. Were we kind enough?
We were really friendly. It's like the friendliest people. Like literally, if I was giving a Flow talk to Flow people, they wouldn't be so kind.
I just,
In the old days of martial arts, when somebody from the right will come please challenge people.
Yeah. Who will join the cause?
what's been
Like
interesting
font,
learning
like
Flow
fonts.
is the more I learn about Flow,
Yeah.
the more it makes me better understand TypeScript, because you know, you have to like retest your assumptions, right?
Yeah. It's good. It's good. I'll try TypeScript and then come back.
All right, thank you, man.
Thank you so much.
Does anyone else have anything else they want to talk about? Lightning talks? Any questions about TypeScript? I'm more than happy to stay for a few minutes and answer questions, or try to answer questions.
And if I recommended you.
Just fire away. I'll hang out for